The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw translated from the German by the spirit of Hegel. Life against life. A bright, intense light woke me. Directly above me, a Jupiter lamp burned. I was lying on something cool and soft. When I tried to put my hand protectively over my eyes, I couldn't lift it. You must lie very still now, I heard someone say. Gradually, my mind became a little clearer. I glanced sideways and saw Tarland in his white coat. He was leaning over a small cart with glass cylinders and devices reflecting the light. My left hand lay on a rubber cushion, a needle stuck in my forearm. A rubber hose connected it to a glass tube through which a bright red liquid flowed. I now also felt something warm and tingling, pulsing through my veins. What does this mean? I thought in amazement. A transfusion? I felt warmer and warmer. Everything around me was so strangely quiet and unreal. Tarleton pushed the apparatus aside, quickly pulled the needle out of his arm, and pressed a piece of gauze against the small wound. Who's singing? I asked. I heard a high, gentle melody and felt very comfortable. Slowly, languidly, my thoughts crawled along. Dismal images passed before me. A hike through deadly silent, brightly lit ravines, shattered crystalline walls, dark pastures, galleries. Where was all this? In a glacier? In the Himalayas? Or was it just a dream? Suddenly, the last trace of what I had still consciously experienced surfaced in my memory. The grotto, dark rock trimmers, a dull, deep silence, and two wires over which I bent to. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, my gaze fell on the television screen on the opposite wall. Many bright dots blinked on the black background. Stars? So, the singing was the voice of the engines. We were flying. Two people entered the cabin. Raina and Arseniev. How are you feeling? Asked the astronomer. Good. I don't know how I came up with that in any case. The first question I asked them was, why did the city glow? Was that lucite? The companions exchanged a glance. No. This barium soda enamel has nothing to do with the lucite. It glows because it was exposed to strong radiation during the explosion. Rainer replied, obviously very pleased that he could give me such a precise information. An explosion? Oh, right, the crater, I said. Listen, Tarlin interrupted me. But you can't talk now. We have so much time. You'll find out everything by then. He asked the two scientists to leave the cabin. I heard him at the door saying something about a concussion, and that I shouldn't be upset. But I'd like to know what happened next, I protested weakly when he returned. Did the passage open? Tarlin took my pulse. Professor Arseniev brought you back from the underworld to the light, and I created you anew. He smiled. I wanted to ask something else, but suddenly everything before my eyes was blurred, dissolved into the far distance. I saw a blue sky above me, birds singing, and then I fell asleep. Only after some time did I learn, from conversations repeatedly interrupted by the watchful Tarland, how Arsenyev had carried me up from the corridor, how he struggled to seal the cracks in my diving suit, how for a moment it seemed to him as if I were in death throes, and how then the truck, summoned by rocket signals, arrived just in time to take us back to the rocket. Unconscious, poisoned by the alien atmosphere, with broken ribs, they had laid me on the operating table. Then, but my recovery progressed rapidly. I almost slept the entire day and woke up at meal times with a wolfish hunger. When I was able to get up, Talon recommended a sun lamp and breathing artificial mountain air. I was still not allowed to ask my companions about the dead city and the inhabitants of Venus. Talon justified his prohibition by saying that after my concussion, I had to be protected from any excitement. In vain, I explained to him that unsatisfied curiosity caused very strong excitement. He then advised me to stay in the control room in front of the large fluorescent screens, since there could be nothing more calming for a convalescent person than the sight of the starry sky. After my accident, the cosmic crater had cruised above the planet for another 6 days, then moved away in a spiral orbit and began its return flight. Observing the stars, of course, didn't calm me down. I finally wanted to know something about the research results. I tormented Tarlet until on the third day of our return flight, when he pulled my strings, I was able to change his mind. The scientists were working in the cabin of the Max. For a while I paced the corridor. That day the engines had been switched off, and the cosmic crater was now flying due to the sun's gravitational pull. The silence that reigned in the rocket seemed to come from eternity. When I entered the dark cabin, my companions were standing at the control panel. The figures in the room stood out as blackish shadows against the greenish glowing screens. The electric motors hummed monotonously. Bundles of wire wound out from the depths of the Marax and ran over groove plates to electromagnetics, where they wound themselves up. Chandrasekhar threw one of the levers, and the end of the last wire curled for a while like a metal worm on the desktop, then wriggled in the air and disappeared into the winding device. The hum of the currents died down. The fluorescent screens were covered with a grey veil, in which the dense cluster and jumble of green hieroglyphs froze and faded. The circular tube of the ceiling light illuminated again. Arsenyev paced the cabin, rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand, stopped, and looked me in the eyes. Do you want to know? I nodded. It's not easy to reconstruct the history of an alien world from surviving fragments, especially when it's a history of destruction, of ruin. The last glimmer of light in the fluorescent screens went out. Grey and dead. They stared from the wall. The chronicles we possess cover in fragments a period of approximately 180 years. The first section we were able to decipher contains a plan for an invasion of Earth. At first I suspected that the domination of Earth was the fulfillment of a mythical religious commandment for the inhabitants of Venus. I considered the depiction of the two crossed-out circles we encountered in the ruins to be a corresponding symbol. However, the chronicles contained an image that deviated from this hypothesis. The planet was inhabited by a coldly calculating race of beings. 150 years before they began to realize their plan, they considered whether they could use humans in some way for their own purposes. They came to the conclusion that we had no value to them, and therefore had to be eliminated. However, since they did not want to damage our cities, streets, and factories, so that they could later use them themselves, they decided to hurl a radioactive cloud against the Earth. After the ionization had decreased, the white sphere began its activity and sent thousands of spaceships to the now dead Earth. They wanted to destroy life and preserve the lifeless. Although they considered every conceivable factor, they forgot to include one, themselves. When the giant ray throwers and the white sphere were nearing completion, the evolutionists began to wage war against each other. They succeeded in achieving their goal, but on their own planet. The cabin wall, with its central control panels and devices, blurred before my eyes. I could only see Arseniev's face as a white spot against a dark background. He continued calmly. Their relationship to the machines is unclear to us. It may be that the machines embodied the supreme state power. In any case, it was they who worked out the precise plan of the attack against Earth. They also created the war plans and sent the inhabitants of their planet to their deaths. But what were they fighting for? Arseniev took a bundle of wires from the plate and weighed it in his hand. It's not clear. Perhaps it was the right to settle on Earth. The inhabitants of Venus possessed a highly developed culture, but all the outstanding designers and builders among them had placed themselves and their prodigious skills at the service of destruction. Such a community of living beings had to turn against itself sooner or later. Consider certain analogies in our own history. The war on Venus lasted many years. Some of its phases are completely incomprehensible to us, quite apart from the large temporal gaps in the chronicles of the cave. Hidden beneath the planet's surface, they bombarded each other with condensed energy charges, showered each other with clouds of poisonous dust, and caused artificial ground displacements and tectonic earthquakes. In these battles, they consumed and wasted amounts of energy sufficient to transform their planet into a blooming garden. A group of beings of a higher intelligence succeeded among the inhabitants of Venus. Their goal was to create and use intelligent machines. These beings remained seemingly neutral for a while, serving both warring parties simultaneously. Among other things, they also provided them with plans for their mutual destruction. That's absurd. And yet it was so. The longer the war lasted, the lower the level of civilization sank. During this process, there were temporary returns to former prosperity due to the temporary periods of peace. Afterward, however, the fighting continued ever more fiercely. The large energy centers changed owners several times. Occasionally, the power plants were shut down because the victors lacked the necessary technical knowledge to restart them. During these times, the neutral inhabitants of Venus probably strove to preserve the creations of civilization, the chronicles and documents, from destruction, and for this purpose built shelters in deserts and among mountains. We encountered the ruins of one such shelter during our expedition to the White Sphere. Gradually, one of the enemy factions began to gain the upper hand. She was already sure of her victory, and that she launched the rocket, which landed over the Tiger in 1908. Here the chronicle ends. We can only speculate about the further course of events. It is conceivable that the greatest catastrophe occurred during the final battle for mastery of the energy system, but it could also be that control over the complex world of machines was simply lost in the end. That the effects of this mechanism, once set in motion, were not at all clear. Perhaps, however, there was another cause for the horrific self-destruction of these creatures, and who knows whether this interpretation is not the most likely, namely, that the defeated party resorted to a last resort to save itself from destruction. The Deuteron charges intended to destroy the Earth. And when is this supposed to have happened? In April 1915, a young Belgian scholar published a paper in which he pointed out a strange jump in the average annual temperature of Venus. The values he had compiled for the period of 14 years fluctuated around 40 degrees Celsius in the last year of observation. However, 290 degrees were recorded. This abnormal temperature rise lasted barely a month. The work was published during the First World War, and at that time no one was concerned with astronomical fantasies. The matter was dismissed at the speculative beginnings of a young researcher and was soon forgotten. The telephone buzzed. Osvetich called the astronomer to headquarters. Earth had reported back. Arseniev went out. Did they all die? I turned to Lao Tzu, who was still bent over the desk, examining drawings and photographs with a large magnifying glass. How was that possible? Why didn't they flutter into the deepest subterranean spaces themselves, where the black plasma is, or are there perhaps still some living in some remote corner of the planet? Of course, we can't be sure, replied the Chinese, and if we are nevertheless firmly convinced of this, it is only because we place great trust in the superior mental power of these beings. That sounds like mockery, but it is actually not so. I remained silent. To destroy oneself in the belief that one is thereby destroying the entire world, that is a great, terrible temptation. The Chinese man narrowed his eyes and looked at me sharply. After a while, Arseniev entered the cabin. He was visibly agitated. Listen, he cried. You still remember that part of the report that astonished us so? At the time, we assumed that the possible occupants of the spaceship had ignored the humans because they were looking for the others, the true creators of earthly civilization. Now this error has been cleared up. They are certainly on Earth, using our material, reworking the translation of the report, and here we have the first result. They were not looking for the creators of our civilization or any living beings, but rather for devices capable of intercepting the destructive charges and hurling them back to Venus. Yes, that's possible, said Lao Tzu, standing up. Has the full text been sent to us yet? Not yet. Dubois will transmit it to me in half an hour. You and my colleague, Chandrasekhar, please come with me right away to headquarters. We can use the opportunity to radio the continuation of the calculations. The mathematician, who had been working behind the isolation wall of the marks until now, appeared between the distribution panels. As if from a great distance, I heard the scientists talking to each other. So that was the end, I said. They wanted to destroy us, but one thing is incomprehensible to me. Were they actually evil by nature? After my words, there was silence. Shanozeka, who was working at the barracks desk, let his hand with the tool drop. I don't think so, he replied. That means, Shanozeka threw the end of the cable he was holding in his other hand onto the desk. What do we know about the inhabitants of this planet? Nothing. We don't know what they look like. We can't even guess. We don't know what their lives were filled with and all of their ideas. We know only one thing, the plan and method to destroy us. He was silent for a moment, then continued. We know the matter is blind. Man brings order to the immeasurable space of the universe, for he creates works, but beings who aim at the destruction of others carry the seeds of their own destruction within themselves, no matter how powerful they are. What can we think of that? Of them? Imagination fails. The human mind recoils at the immense amount of suffering and death contained in the phrase the destruction of a planet. Should we condemn these creatures? Were they monsters inhabiting Venus? I don't believe it. Weren't there also on Earth, within the human community, the most terrible wars in which farmers, fishermen, potters, carpenters, civil servants, and artists were deceived and forced to kill one another? And were the millions and millions who perished in the wars worse than us? Did they deserve nothing but this scandalous death? Professor Arseniev is of the opinion that machines drove the inhabitants of Venus into the abyss. That is not yet certain, but let us assume that it actually happened. Yes, weren't there also beings on Earth who did what seems absurd to you? Pilot, weren't there no dealers of such death among us who served both warring parties in wars and sold them weapons? We can find many parallels here, and that is no coincidence, for there must be common laws to which the history of rational beings is subject. Rational beings. How bitter the word sounds in this context. However, there is a difference between us and the inhabitants of Venus that is as great as that between life and death. Above all the cities of this planet hovered atomic suns, shining not for eternity to give life and promote its prosperity, but only for a single moment to extinguish it. At a temperature of millions of degrees, these magnificent buildings boiled and melted. Their machines burned, the radio station masts burst, and the underground pipelines shattered. Thus emerged the landscape we saw a few decades after the catastrophe. Ruins, fields of debris, deserts, forests of solidified crystals, rivers of seething plasma, and the white sphere, the last witness to this apocalypse, whose mechanisms, uncontrolled by anyone, are still restlessly active. Without any purpose or benefit, tremendous energies are being unleashed, and this will continue as long as the black plasma pulsates in the underground storage facilities and conduits. Hundreds of years, perhaps, unless humanity takes possession of this planet in the meantime. A terrible legacy, I whispered. Yes, said Arseniev, but life alone gives the world its meaning. That is why we will have the courage to return to Venus. We will forever cherish the memory of its tragedy, the tragedy of life that rose up against life and was itself destroyed in the process. Arseniev stepped to the television. Friends, the expedition to Venus is only a stage, the first step on a path whose final destination none of us can guess. I am convinced that we will also transcend the boundaries of our solar system, that we will set foot on thousands of celestial bodies orbiting other suns. After millions, perhaps billions of years, the time will come when mankind will populate the entire Milky Way, and the lights of the night sky will be as close, as familiar to him, as the lights of distant houses. We can only dimly sense these times, but one thing I know is that love will not cease to exist until then, for only through it is the beauty of the world reflected in the eyes of one's neighbour. Arsenyev stood under the fluorescent screen. A faint glare from the swarms of shimmering stardust seemed to fall on his face. For a long time he remained in silence, as if he were listening to voices from infinitely distant worlds. Then the telephone rang. Lao Tzu picked up the receiver, then placed it next to the phone, and looked over at Arsenyev. "The Earth is calling us,"